Welcome to another in the series of Perth US Asia Centre Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Australia's High Commissioner to India, the Honourable Barry O'Farrell AO. I think most of you will know Barry from his long time in politics. He was 20 years in the New South Wales Parliament, including serving as the 43rd Premier of New South Wales. During that time, he was actively involved in Australia's relationship with India. He served as Deputy Chair of the Australia-India Council and led many trade missions there. And so it's particularly fortunate that we have him as our representative in Delhi today. I would note that in somewhat of a first, it's a unique environment to be starting off as Australia's diplomatic envoy to Delhi. High Commissioner O'Farrell, I understand, was the first person ever to be sworn in, or rather to present his credentials virtually, given the environment. So Ambassador O'Farrell, High Commissioner O'Farrell, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Gordon, and thank you for everything that the Centre does across the region, but particularly in relation, from my perspective, with India.
Well, for those of you who know, the Perth US Asia Centre for the last 6.5 years has run an ongoing series of small roundtable ambassadors dialogues. And we had one just a month ago with High Commissioner O'Farrell, which was so fascinating in its content that we thought it was something that would be worthwhile sharing with our broader group of community that support the Perth US Asia Centre and remain deeply interested in the relationship with India. And so today we're just going to go through some of the highlights of that conversation with particular focus on what we need to understand here in Perth, in Western Australia, and Australia more broadly about on-the-ground developments in India and in the Australia-India relationship. And I think you really can't have a conversation anywhere after March of 2020 without starting out with the big elephant in the room, and that is COVID-19. Obviously, given a population of 1.3 billion people, India has a unique challenge. There's been a lot of news reports just in recent days about the total number, not per capita, but the total number in India surpassing that in Brazil. So clearly this is an issue that is of concern not just to Australia, but of deep concern to the country in which you're serving right now. Could you just kind of give us an update of India's response to COVID-19, how it's handling it, and what the prospects look like?
Well, Gordon, I think firstly, it's important to put it into perspective. We know it's a 1.34 billion person country. But we know that like other countries around the world, India has not yet reached that peak from which most countries, including Australia, and hopefully at the moment with the second wave, then start to decline. But if I can put it if I can present it in the basis of cases per million, India has just over 3,000 confirmed cases per million, which compares to the UK, which has got 5.1 thousand, the US, which has got close to 19,000. Of course, in Australia, it's just over 1,000. So, for Australian audiences, India's case rate is 3 times what it is in Australia, in a country of $1.34 billion. But, the important thing, as we've seen this debate in Australia, is that lockdowns can't last forever because, lives and livelihoods depend upon the restarting of our economies. And I've just come from a briefing with the senior minister and the diplomatic corps who made the point that the Prime Minister's decision here to have an early lockdown was correct and the right thing to do because it gave the health system a capacity to build up. We know over that time that testing capacity and test result capacities were increased. We know that the number of COVID beds were increased by 3-fold. We know that India started to ramp up its pharmaceutical manufacturing to start building ventilators, which it hadn't done previously, and to invest in the production of PPE. And those things undoubtedly saved countless lives. And in that way, it served an important objective. So the continuing challenge here remains the capacity of India's states to treat COVID patients, because like Australia, India is a federation just 5 to 6 times larger. Some state systems, some state health systems are very good. I happen to be in Delhi, where the health system is very good. There are other health systems that are less than perfect, and as we've seen in the Australian system, there are variations. So the challenge is to continue to look at the capacity of India's regions to treat COVID-19 patients and ensure that India's various policy settings and restrictions are being applied in a coherent and a clear way. And by that I mean, as we've seen in Australia, there are those people that embrace the need to socially distance, to wash hands, do all those things, and there are those people that not only don't do it, but on occasions take to the streets to protest some inferred civil liberty that's been upset. But look, let's continue to reflect on India's circumstances, on its size, and be reminded that nowhere in the world is there an example of probably any country that's had an easy time responding to this virus.
Is there a general sense of optimism about the initial response and the trajectory, or is this is one of these things where there's enough uncertainty that no one really quite knows what the coming months and years are going to hold?
No one quite knows when India is going to reach that peak from which there will then be a decline. And that's, I remember in Australia in March and April, the same view was evident. But I have to say that 6 months on, what I believe is happening is that people are starting to manage risk. And many people are doing so successfully. So, I'm blessed, and I touched the wooden desk here, that the High Commission here, which has a reasonably large staff, albeit slimmed down in terms of the immediate response post the lockdown, has had a very light brush. There hasn't been a case here at the High Commission, and that's similar across most of the diplomatic missions here. And that doesn't mean that. So I think people are managing the risk. I think people are a bit mentally and personally sapped by the fact there's no inline in place. And I'm saying that about the general community, but the health system, the doctors, the governments are doing and saying all that's possible, all that you should expect them to say. But this virus, as we've seen in Australia, has a bad habit of popping up when you least want it to.
India has always had a large population, has always been known for its large population, but interest in India in terms of its economy really has changed dramatically over the last 20 years, particularly the last decade. And that wasn't just on the basis of its population, but based on its economic growth rate, on what has been a gradual but increasing rate of reforms in India that have led to a lot of presumptions and forward projections about where India will be in the future in terms of its growth rate and thus its economic weight in the region. That clearly has been something that has driven Australia's interest. That the government has put out a couple of years ago an Australia-India economic strategy, based largely on those forecasts. I wonder if you might address the economy, how it's being impacted by COVID-19, and then how that is impacting the pace of the economic reforms and openings, because it seems that the Indian economy was already a little bit weak before COVID hit. So I'm curious as to how we should interpret those trends today.
Well, India went into COVID as a $3 trillion economy with ambitions of being a $5 trillion economy within a decade or so. And again, at the briefing I've just heard from a senior government minister, they continue to believe that $5 trillion economy is still possible. But clearly, as our Prime Minister himself has said, we're all going to come out of COVID a bit poorer, and it will take a time to ramp up. But, what we've seen in India during this crisis is what you'd hope to see in a country like this during the crisis, and that is the significant reforms that have been announced and the significant reforms that were announced prior to COVID. So we've seen reforms here and efforts to liberalise within the economy, to reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers, to open up the country to investment from overseas, deregulation, and significant gains with a report only released last week in terms of the ease of doing business. And India's current reforms, particularly in agriculture and the mining sectors, are incredibly encouraging. But I'd acknowledge, Gordon, that the road is long, but there are opportunities. India has a large and increasingly tech-savvy population. As I was reminded by the minister who briefed us, 40% of the population is aged between 15 and 25, and 2/3 are under 35. That's an incredible dividend for a country, and it'll be important. And this is a country that will be important as both a market as well as a source of labour. in terms of some of the industries that you think about in India and that we're relying on, there is a surfeit of engineers here, which bodes well for that tech savvy, for that intention to turn that tech savvy into an increasing industry. So as India seeks to develop its domestic manufacturing capacity under the self-reliant India policy, the Atman, I won't do my Hindi again, I'm hopeless at it. Australia does have an important part to play, and it's an opportunity for us. And just one example, Gordon, and it's a Western Australian example, is that Australia, particularly Western Australia, is the home to many of the critical mineral resources and rare earths that are going to be needed by India to boost its economy, and particularly its manufacturing economy. If India wants to have and achieve its goal of the world's best and biggest electric vehicle industry, but wants to have its goal and achieve its desire to be the main centre of producing electric batteries, it needs lithium and it needs nickel, and that can come from Australia. And so Australia has elements that can be fed into India's self-reliant policy, which is a policy about ensuring that India is not again caught short, as it frankly was in relation to COVID. We know that India is a centre of pharmaceutical manufacturing. It's a pharmacy to the world, and it's continued to be a pharmacy to the world through COVID. But it discovered that something like 70% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients were being imported from other countries. It's determined to fix that problem, and that's what self-reliance means to them: is being able to develop their industries, to grow jobs for their citizens, to increase the wealth of their country and therefore the living standards of their citizens. And we have elements that can help that. And education and tourism, for instance, will remain as important as ever, and important to Australia's growth as we bounce back. And so these are issues that India's tackling. It's endeavouring to develop them. And I think one of the reasons that we're in a better place to assist them is that the fact that Australians of Indian descent now account for 1 in 35 Australians mean that this is a country that's no longer strange to us. This is a country where as a citizenry, we have greater Indian literacy. And I think that will be a great platform upon which to build the economic relationship that certainly the government, Austrade and my colleagues here at the High Commission are keen to develop.
My own guess is that in the post-COVID era, what for India has been a long-standing focus on self-reliance will probably in different words become a theme in many countries, including Australia. I mean, the focus on the integrity of supply chains and security of supply chains are very important. You may recall that last year we hosted our annual In the Zone conference focused on critical materials. We were delighted to have former Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, who's leading the counterpart India-Australia economic strategy, join us and participate. And you're absolutely correct. There's keen interest, at least in the West Australian picture, on those critical materials that are going to be very important for India going forward. Again, whether you use the term self-reliance or integrity of supply chains, however you look at it. Historically, India is always going to be compared with China. And that comparison has not always been favorable to India. But one area where I think it is increasingly favorable is the news we've just seen today. The fact that for the first time since the 1970s, Australia will not have any of its news organizations represented on the ground in China, with the pullout of 2 ABC reporters today. Obviously, the fact that India is a democratic society, that we have a vibrant civil society engagement with India is a plus on that front. But one of the things I think that analysts in Australia kind of miss is that our current ongoing challenges vis-a-vis China are not unique. Whether you're Vietnam or the Philippines in the South China Seas or Korea or Japan and India as well. So even today, there have been ongoing stories about what has been an increasingly sensitive and difficult contestation, if you will, on the border between India and China. Can you, again, I realize this is not your primary responsibility, but sitting in Delhi, could you help us understand how India, or at least the government of India today, is looking at China as a way of helping those of us here in Australia understand that our current situation is not necessarily as unique as we might think it would be?
So Gordon, I think the first point is that the government of India has been clear itself that it seeks a strong and productive relationship with China. And when you think about that, which sounds a bit odd at the same time as you're having a border dispute. That's consistent with all of India's international engagement, particularly since Prime Minister Modi became Prime Minister. He's reached out to the world. He's forged relationships with the successive Australian Prime Ministers and with world leaders. And I have no doubt that he does so for a very great nationalist reason, which is he wants to engage with those countries, have good relations with those countries to ensure that his country benefits. And China fits within that as well. But it's obvious that the recent border tensions have created anti-China sentiment across India. And that's been seen and reported on in terms of product boycotts by citizens and a focus by citizens on the countries of origins of products that they're buying. But from the outset of the border crisis, the Indian government has endeavoured to de-escalate the tensions and has sought to resolve the dispute diplomatically. So this is a government, like many governments, including the Australian government, that can do two things at once. It can have a dispute over here on trade, and it can continue to talk to the government on other issues. And that's I suppose that's what's diplomacy about. And I only say that as a surprise because, as you know, I'm not a trained diplomat. But when it comes to the India-China border, Australia's position is obviously clear. We want an Indo-Pacific region where territorial disputes and competing claims are resolved peacefully by the countries and in a way that's consistent with international law. That's the direction we're heading in, and there's a seat on the bus for everybody. And that's what I think's important to recognise. We've urged restraint along the line of actual control. We have supported continued moves towards de-escalation. We oppose any attempts to unilaterally alter the status quo, because that can only serve to increase tensions and the risk of instability in the region. And we consider it important, as I said, that bilaterally agreed principles and norms that help prevent escalation or miscalculation in the border areas over many decades continue to be observed. India, as we know, historically has been a great nuancer when it comes to diplomatic relationships. I think at the present time, they've got a Prime Minister who's prepared to step up and step out in the world and take more and more positions, which I think is a good thing. And the other great asset they have at this time, including in this dispute, is the steady hand of Dr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, which is also on the tiller. So China and India are clearly grappling with an age-old dispute about a border that the British left in a shape that was less than clear. They have had agreement for so long and some rules around it for so long. It's re-emerged, and I maintain confidence in the Indian government of being able to resolve the matter.
Your focus on Australia's positioning being based on international rule of law reminds me of what is kind of a mantra in Australian foreign policy: the rules-based order, the rules-based order. Do you perceive India as being a supporter of the rules-based order?
I do, but I do, and I think rules-based orders are important. We need to not only have international and multilateral institutions that are representative and responsive, but we also need to have some rules, as we've had since the Second World War, that provide us with certainty when issues, whether it's the South China Sea or something else, arises, that we can have hope and confidence will be resolved. I think, Gordon, if I sense you're moving in the direction of trade, I think that what we saw in 2016 with the world's largest economy and its vocal democratic citizenry raising concerns about whether the international trade rules are being fair to them. We're seeing that replicated in other parts of the world. We've seen part of it in Australia. We've seen it certainly across parts of Europe. And is that sentiment here in India? Yes. Is it the predominant sentiment? I don't believe so. And as I said when we had the more informal dialogue, if asked, I believe that India will continue to trade with the world and will continue to engage in trade with the world, notwithstanding decisions like those on RCEP.
So let's actually move directly then into trade, because this is one area where In the past, efforts to negotiate an Australia-India free trade agreement have been very difficult, given the attitudes you've just been talking about. For the last several years, there was great hopes for India's participation in the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership Free Trade Negotiations, RCEP. But this year, India has decided to pull out of those. And so it looks like now, if what I hear out of Canberra is correct, that we hope to come to some conclusion on RCEP by the end of this year. And yet India won't be part of it. I wonder if you might address kind of the future then. What are the next steps for Australia-India trade relations and Australia-India economic relations if India is not part of RCEP, they're not part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Where do we go from here?
So the good news is, out of the comprehensive strategic partnership that was agreed between our two prime ministers in June, we again committed ourselves to re-engage with a free trade agreement between our two countries, the CECA. That's a good thing. It's a sign that India wants to engage with Australia, and work is progressing on that as we speak. But I was surprised to discover, again, because I'm new here, that India has free trade agreements with something like 80 to 90% of the countries who are signing up to RCEP. So there are many bilateral free trade agreements and multilateral free trade agreements, including an ASEAN agreement that India is a partner to. And so, for the reasons that it gave at the time, for reasons that related to at least its concern that China and goods from China made through the cover of RCEP cause some damage to the Indian economy, it took a local decision. It's not a decision that Australia supports. Australia keeps the door open to India to joining RCEP, and that's certainly our position. But at the end of the day, whether it's Australia, whether it's India, whether it's any other country around the world, decisions will be made by the national governments. But I don't believe the naysayers that exist within Australia that RCEP's a sign that we will never advance our economic relationship. I think our economic relationship is increasing in importance. And can I say this to you, Gordon, and to the viewers, that I wouldn't be here if I didn't know that I had a senior leadership in Canberra that was determined to put in a full 3-year effort, a full-term effort on the India-Australia relationship. And that was important to me, Gordon, because as a former Premier and then as someone who maintained an interest in India when I left politics, what had frustrated me under successive governments of both parties was that old Allen Gyngell quote that every Prime Minister discovers India, but then gets distracted and moves on. And I'm convinced that because he's told me on a number of occasions that Prime Minister Morrison, the Foreign Affairs Minister Maurice Payne, and the Trade Minister Simon Birmingham are determined to try and put a full 3-year effort into India. And given COVID, that's absolutely the right thing to be doing, because there are opportunities because of the desire of business and others to diversify. And the economic relationship is going to be increasingly important and will be assisted in, as I say, because of that Indian diaspora in Australia who give us an understanding, who give us a few openings. And they and all the Australians of India's descent leave an indelible mark on it, will leave an indelible mark on our economy and society for the better. On what I'd like to see in relation to that economy, well, we'd obviously like to see a good quality trade deal done between the two of us. Andrew Robb still bears the scars of his attempt to deliver that, which in part was curtailed by his own, shorter ministerial career. We'd like to boost the India literacy of Australian business community. There are persistent perceptions of India, some of which are negative, in fact, most of which are negative, and an underappreciation of just how fast India has developed, how fast it's come, how fast it's changed, what the reforms that have led to those changes are. And this is an area that Austrade and Invest India can assist to clarify for Australian business. And I have to say, Gordon, I'm also worried that due to a failure by business in Australia to diversify in recent years, I think Australian business has lost the understanding and I think sometimes the capacity for that resilience and understanding needed and the persistence needed in opening up new markets. Opening up a new market is never easy. And yet for some reason, because of its Australian businesses' dealings with other countries in North Asia, it's expecting it to be relatively simple. Well, that's not the way things happen. That's not the way we normally get success in our lives or in our businesses. And the other thing that I think we need is closer collaboration on the reopening of air links between our countries when circumstances allow, because that will help re-establish our educational, tourism and cultural links. And we know that as we went into COVID, Indian students were the second largest cohort in Australia. We know going into COVID that tourism from India was the fastest growth rate of any sector of tourism in Australia. And we know that one of the benefits of so many Indian students coming to Australia was that their parents and families were also travelling as well. So air links are important too.
Well, you won't be surprised that in the 6.5 years of our existence, our mantra really has been the same: diversify, 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 priority that you laid out there. One of the unintended but potential silver linings of the difficult year we're having right now in COVID is that I do think that there is a greater receptivity to that message, as we've got ongoing tensions with our largest trading partner, but also disruption to the existing patterns of trade in the region. And so I'm hopeful that under your leadership and given everything you just laid out so articulately, the India will clearly get a second look. Now, earlier I asked
you got to say, Gordon, though, that geez, if after everything business in Australia has gone through in recent months, after what the world's gone through with disrupted supply chains, we don't get the message finally that India has to be taken seriously as an economic partner, that we need to grow trade investment in both directions. I really would worry then about the foresight or the lack of foresight of Australian business.
Well, the good news is I do see a much greater receptivity to that. Now the question really is how you go about it. And again, I think your team and the Austrade team you mentioned are well positioned. It's also worth noting that in addition to you setting the groundwork of being India's first ever virtual presentation of credentials, we had our first ever virtual summit between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison. And that's a good indication that things are proceeding despite the current environment going forward. So appreciate that. Just two final things, and I'll kind of tie the two together. First, having asked about China, I wonder if I might ask a little about the United States. Obviously, here in Perth, I presume in Delhi as well, there's an awful lot of attention being paid to the U.S. elections, just 50 some odd days out. We at the Perth U.S. Asia Center several years ago created what we called an Indo-Pacific Research Network, and together with the United States Study Center did a series of public opinion polls in the region, including India. One of the remarkable things was in 2017, after the election of President Trump, in every country in the region, including Australia, when we asked the question, what do you feel about the leadership of the United States? Obviously better worded than that. There had been a drop between 2016 and 2017. But when we triggered very specifically President Trump, we said now that President Trump is president, it resulted in a further 10% drop in almost every other country, with the exception of India, where when we triggered Trump, it actually went up. And so India's kind of been a bit of an outlier in the region. President Trump himself had a summit there relatively recently. But now we've got a very interesting dynamic. An Indian American, Kamala Harris, is on the ticket as a vice presidential candidate. I'm curious just how you see Indian views of political developments in the U.S. as you watch the media, as your team get a sense for the current environment there.
Well, Gordon, your commentary around the polling that was undertaken, in a sense, doesn't surprise me, because India is an incredibly aspirational country, and why wouldn't they look at someone like Donald Trump, who certainly back in 2016 was presented as this internationally successful businessman and figure of wealth. Now, I'm not making any comments about him. I'm not giving any editorials, but I think this is an aspirational country, and there'd be tens of millions of people across this country who'd like to have a fraction of his lifestyle. And I don't think that's any different to people at times in Australia looking to some of our more prosperous people and saying, I hope one day I can do that if we work hard. But look, practically, In India, there's been a strong growth in the US-India relationship for more than a decade. And interestingly, as much as people say, well, how's Modi going to cope when Trump goes because they get on so well? Well, people seem to have forgotten already just how well Modi got on with Obama. As I said before, Modi is an engager of the world. The Modi hug is famous, and it's missed in these times when we're doing social interactions. And as I said, Dr. Jaishankar adds a steady hand to the wheel as well. So that US-India relationship is built on close people-to-people business, technology, defence and strategic ties. The last time I looked at, most of the large tech companies in the United States were run by Indian Americans. That's how close it is. The growth of the US-India relationship is hugely significant for us as well, and is underappreciated, I think, across Australia. And New Delhi does regard the relationship as bipartisan. There's strong support for India on both sides of the aisle, as they say in the United States, as is also the case in India. And Modi, as I said, was close to Obama. He's been close to Trump, but I think he'll be close to whoever is president of the United States. And of course, there's incredible interest and pride in US politicians of Indian heritage, whether it's Kamala Harris or whether it's Nikki Haley. So, there's lots of interest in the elections, Gordon. I'm one of those that believes in self-correcting democracy. So let's see what happens.
Well, you've been exceptionally balanced in your response, so thank you so much. I appreciate that. Look, one area in the Australia-India relationship that isn't aspirational, that's happening today, is been the remarkable development in security and strategic relations. We've gone from an era where there may have been a rediscovery of India to whether it's cooperation in the Quad, to naval exercises, to just the overall perception in Australia of India as a very important emerging defense partner, security partner, and increasing recognition in India of Australia as, again, a strategic partner in the region. Can you kind of address where you see the current state of our defense and strategic relationship, and where do you think it should be going in the future?
Well, I think that relationship is at its highest ever point, and that probably was reflected in the Modi-Morrison summit on the 4th of June. We know that over past months and years, we've seen an increase in military cooperations with India, and that's a good thing. And importantly, we out of that summit, we've both decided, along with other countries who want to get on the bus in the direction we're heading in, that we want to contribute to a more secure, open, inclusive and prosperous Indo-Pacific. We decided that we wanted to make our economy stronger and more resilient, and we committed to strengthening the multilateral institutions so that they can deliver more for all of us and for our neighbours. And what came from those conversations is that it's more important than ever for what in this business they call like-minded democracies like Australia and India to shape the region and the world in which we live. And what we mean by that is countries that have the same values, that have the same outlook on the world, who believe in the same things and want to do good in the world. And that's what that's what drove the historic elevation in the relationship as a comprehensive strategic partnership in the virtual summit. And the elements of that partnership are defence and maritime security, cyber security and technology, science and research and critical supply chains. We signed 8 agreements across those areas. There's a lot of practical cooperation between Australia and India involving officials behind the scenes, which I can't go into for obvious reasons in this interview. But one of the areas I can discuss is our close cooperation on COVID-19 throughout this pandemic. Our health ministers have discussed and shared approaches to treatments and vaccines regularly during the crisis. And under the Australian-India Strategic Research Fund, our largest jointly funded scientific research fund with any country, will announce in October the successful recipients for joint funding of projects addressing the challenges brought on by the pandemic. And that builds on the 10-year program of joint health research under the initiative. And as I've said before many times, Gordon, that the heads of foreign ministries of Australia and India, along with Japan, the Republic of Korea, the United States, Vietnam and New Zealand have met regularly by phone and other means during the crisis, developing shared approaches to critical health supply chain issues and coordinating our assistance across the region. So, if you want to see, what a strong strategic relationship looks like, just look at the work that Frances Adamson's been doing with her colleagues. Look at the work that's been happening in the science field, as well as looking at the work that's obviously being done across the security, intelligence, defence sectors.
One of the perhaps unintentional but very real forms of psychological torture in the COVID-19 era is Facebook, which throws up to you these reminders of things you did. So, last year at this time I was in Mumbai, and 2 years ago it throws a picture of the Lodi Gardens, and 3 years ago I had me at Humayun's tomb. And it reminds me that I'm now in a Western Australian bubble, unable to travel outside of Western Australia, that the borders between Australia and India are closed. This will be the first time in the last 4 years I've not had the opportunity to be directly with you and your colleagues in the High Commission there in Delhi. I'm wondering, as a final question, you might, recognizing the existing challenges we face, the closed borders, the difficulty in connection, give some final advice for how businesses, students, those who are engaged in that, how can we continue to engage with India in the COVID era as we prepare for and wait for the borders to open up so that we can engage in person again?
I know a couple of 100 years ago, Gordon, people said go west. Well, I'd simply say go social. The fact is that we've learned in this crisis that interactions like this are possible. We always knew they were possible, but no one bothered. We picked up the phone, or at best, or we jumped on a plane, because particularly politicians, and I say this as a former politician, love to travel. But now we've discovered that we can create relationships. My introduction to diplomacy in India, my introduction to the diplomatic service, to politicians, to bureaucrats, to business has been done through these mechanisms. And I've built up some reasonably warm relationships, which has surprised me. So, whether you're a student, you can study online, and happily, under changes made, that study, is recognised in our visa system now. If you're a scientist, you can collaborate. You can still collaborate without being in the same lab as a person. If you are a business person, you through Austrade or on your own can make connections with businesses here. Look to talk to departments here about opportunities that exist, and grow the list of opportunities that you may be preparing for in a post-COVID world. So, I think the message is the same since there were two people walking this earth, which is say good day in any way you can, form a relationship and see what happens.
Well, thank you. I couldn't think of a more upbeat note on which to wrap up this discussion. Hopefully this conversation will be part of that will inspire those of us, those in our Perth US Asia Center community who are interested to kind of reach out and make those virtual connections. On behalf of us, High Commissioner, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your time. And we look forward to continue to engage with you and your team virtually until we can once again be there in person, because the one thing that you can't do virtually is enjoy Indian food in India.
Indeed. Thanks, Gordon. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thanks.